So what we're going to be doing is another version of the weekly pay. We did the weekly pay assignment in week one, and we did have the user input the regular hours and the overtime hours. So what we're going to do is we're going to have the user put in one set of hours, and we're going to determine if it's over 40. So if they give us more than 40 hours, then we will, if it's true, then we'll go ahead and calculate overtime pay. If they give us less than 40 hours, we'll calculate regular pay. So one thing I'm going to do, first we'll declare the variables we need for this weekly pay assignment addition. So the variables we'll use is we'll use regular hours. So I'm just going to call it regular hours. And then we'll need a pay rate variable. And then we'll also need along with the pay rate variable, we'll need a weekly pay variable. So this will be the answer of how much they get for that week. And then we'll make them all real numbers. Okay, so once we have our declarations, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a function or module method to ask the user to input the values. So instead of doing an output and input, I'm going to put those into a function and then call them twice, once for the regular hours and once for the pay rate. So I'm going to create a function first. So I'm going to do my function manager, and I'm going to do an add. And I'm going to call this function input real. Okay, and I'm going to add a parameter to this. And this parameter will be whatever message I want to output. So this would be like the first output the prompt we put out to ask the user to enter something. And so this is going to be a string message. So we'll click OK. And then we're going to give a return type. Since this is a real value, we're going to return a real. And the return variable, doesn't matter what we call it. We could say, I'll just call it input number. Okay, and so this will be what the user inputs. We will get back to the call. So we've got our input real created. We click done, and now we're in our input real function. And so you see here we're passing a string message to it. We have a real input number declared that we're going to return. So what we do is we'll just output the message that they gave us. So the message we get passed to us, we will output that on the screen, and then we will do our input into the input number. And this will allow us to input anything we want in this value here and return it. So we can do multiple inputs with this, and then we can just call it one time, and that'll give us all the inputs we need. So this is our input real. So we have an output of the message that we're going to take from there, and then we input into the input number that we're going to return back to the call. So once we have this, then we'll go back to our main. And in here, we'll call that with an assign because it's coming back with something. And so we want to save what's coming back with it. So I'm going to do an assign, and the first assign I'm going to do is on the variable for regular hours. And so I'm going to pass, first I got to call it. I'm going to pass to my call or my input real function, which we just created. This is calling it. Here, I'm going to pass to it the string enter hours worked. Okay, and this in the parentheses here, this string will be stored in message in our input real, and that will get output on the screen, and then we'll get back the value. And so that'll give us how many hours, the user will type in how many hours they worked, and we'll get that back. So then we can do that again, the same assign, another assign, the same function call, but with a different value in the passing and a different variable to store it. So we need the pay rate, right? So I'm going to store the value they put in into the pay rate here. And then I'm going to call the input real function, passing to it the message enter pay rate. Okay, and this will give us back the usual type and how much the employee gets per hour, and we'll get that back. So then what we're going to check is with our if selection here, we're going to check if they gave us 40 or greater. So in our if here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, is the regular hours, reg hours, is that greater than 40? If it is greater than 40, true, then I'm going to calculate overtime pay. If it isn't greater than 40, if it's 40 or under, then I'm going to calculate regular pay. So now the regular pay is going to be pretty simple. So I'm going to do an assign over here. And the regular pay will just be the pay rate they gave us times the hours they gave us. And that will go into our weekly pay. So that's the weekly pay variable that we're going to store the answer in. And on the right here, we'll do our regular hours times the pay rate they gave us. And so that'll give us their employees' regular weekly pay for 40 hours or under. Okay. Now, if they put in more than 40 in the regular hours, then we won't do this on the left. We'll do over here on the right, which means we need to know how many hours they worked, and we also need to know the overtime and everything. So in this assign, this is going to be a little bigger. I'm going to come. Last time we did this, I showed examples of doing it in multiple levels. So we did multiple variables with different things in it. In this one, I'm going to do one variable, and I'm going to do one large expression. So the first thing we need to do is we need to know how many hours did they work overtime. So I'm going to take the regular hours they worked. I'm going to subtract 40 from it. Now I'm putting this in parentheses because I want the program when it runs to do this first. Then once I have that, I'm going to take that times the overtime pay. And the overtime pay will be the pay rate times 1.5. Now I want the code to do that pay rate before it multiplies these two together. So it's going to figure out what the pay rate is here, overtime, take that times the regular hours, the overtime hours that they worked, anything over 40. And then I need, so that's the overtime pay. Then I need to add that to the regular hours pay rate. So I'm going to do the reg hours times the pay rate. And so this will give me their weekly pay, including not reg hours. Wrong thing. Instead of reg hours, I need to do 40. And the reason I need to do 40 instead of reg hours is because regular hours is larger than that. So like they put in 45 or they put in 50 or 60. The regular pay is only for 40 hours. It's not for anything above that. Anything above that, which is the number of hours that we find out here in this calculation, will be 1.5 times. Okay, so this should give us the correct pay. And then we'll do an output here that'll give us our answer. And so we'll say here in our output that the weekly pay is, and I'll do a space in the double quotes, and then I'll do my and sign here, and we'll tack on weekly pay to that. Now, in order to make this look even a little better, what I'm going to do is inside the double quotes here, I'm going to pop a $sign in there. So this will say weekly pay is $, and then we'll have whatever the calculation was. Okay. So now if I run this and I put in 40 or less, I'm going to do this calculation and get a weekly pay, and then I'll output it here. If I run this and I do more than 40, I'll get this calculation, do the weekly pay, and then put it here. Okay. So now if we run this, you'll see here, it pops into the input reel and we have our enter hours worked. And so in our enter hours worked here, if I say the user worked 40 hours and the employee works at $10 an hour, I'll get back that their weekly pay is 400. If I run this again and say they worked 45 hours and say their pay rate is 10, I don't get 450, I get 475. And that's because they worked overtime. And so they get $15 per hour for every hour over 40 because they get $10 an hour. Cool. So that's a if here, an if statement, selection statement that has a greater than symbol. And so again, this greater than symbol here, the regular hours is going to be holding a number, and that number is either going to be larger or smaller than 40. Depending on what number the user put in, the regular hours is equaling here or holding, then we will be either true, larger than 40, we'll go over here, or we have false, less than 40, we'll go over here. And so we'll do one of these paths, and when we're done, we'll have a weekly pay down here that's calculated either from this one or from this one, depending on which path we did based on how many hours they entered.